Hi there, guys. So we have the news today that Keir Starmer's found some money down the back of the sofa for defence. But before I get into that, I'd be extremely grateful if you could subscribe and like the video if you find what I talk about interesting. It just helps me to grow the channel. So thanks a lot. So let's get into this story then. So this is on the BBC website. It says the UK is to buy nuclear-capable F-35A fighter jets, and the government is going to buy at least 12 of these new fighter jets, and they can carry nuclear bombs apparently. Keir Starmer said at the NATO summit in The Hague that the US-made F-35A jets would join NATO's airborne nuclear mission. We will procure at least 12 and we will make these aircraft able to bear nuclear weapons if necessary. Downing Street says the move is the biggest strengthening of the UK's nuclear posture in a generation. And in terms of the rationale behind it, Keir Starmer said, in an era of radical uncertainty, we can no longer take peace for granted, which is why my government is investing in our national security. And then finally, in terms of the wider cost to the UK of this increased spending, he says, Sir Keir has pledged to meet a new NATO target to spend 5% of the UK's GDP on national security by 2035. At the NATO summit, 32 member countries are expected to agree on the goal, which sees 3.5% going to core defence, with the rest on defence-related areas. And just for context, so that 3.5% that's mentioned there, the UK government currently spends 2.4% on core defence, so it's a huge increase in our current level of spending. So, what does this news story tell us then about the UK in 2025? We've got this commitment from Starmer to increase spending on national security to 5% of GDP, 3.5% of which will be spent on core defence. And then last year, we also had the commitment from the government to spend $3 billion a year on the Ukraine, on support to Ukraine, and that's going to last until at least 2030. But I wanted to talk about this in terms of choices, really, for the government, because just yesterday in the newspapers, and also today, I've seen Starmer's been responding to some questions on this, but the government, absolutely doubled down on their commitment to cut PIP for vulnerable and sick people. It's just interesting the juxtaposition between this, this massive increase in spending on defence, and then at the same time, apparently, it's absolutely essential that we push these sick and vulnerable people into poverty to save £5 billion so that we can balance the books at the Treasury. And if you remember as well, we also had the ridiculous claim from the government last year that there would be a run on the pound if the winter fuel allowance wasn't withdrawn from pensioners. Yeah, to put it bluntly, I think the Labour Party are full of crap when it comes to their sort of financial commitments. This is a wealthy country, and we can see with this latest news on defence, and with their rowing back on the winter fuel allowance, that there is money available whenever the government deems it important. So that brings me to the wider point then about this government, and going back to what I said earlier about choices. They speak so passionately, and when you see Starmer speak, it's one of the only times that he does show any passion. They speak passionately about issues of defence, and they also put their money where their mouth is when it comes to defence. But then at the same time, they speak so disparagingly about sick and vulnerable people, and they insinuate at every turn that sick and vulnerable people are work shy, and not, and they're not in jobs, and they should be. And simultaneously, they try to remove funding and support from those people at every opportunity. And it just shows where Labour's priorities are, in terms of their choices. And I think it's also, and also to add to that, I think it's also quite cowardly. A Labour Party committed to social justice, which is its founding principle after all, they would be able to do both. The government has got so many levers that they can pull in terms of tax policy. They could fund both defence and social security with a wealth tax, for example, or by equalising capital gains tax with income tax. There's loads of different options for the government to consider, and the fact that they haven't done that tells you a lot. Now, in terms of the politics of all of this, so I'm making this argument from a left-wing perspective because obviously I want to see sick and vulnerable people supported. However, the same argument's also being made from the right, who are saying currently that, Starmer's he's spending X amount of money on asylum seekers, he's spending all of this money on Ukraine, and that money should be used and funneled into supporting people in this country, fixing the roads or improving the NHS. So he's taking flack from both sides, and I think, and I think in terms of the politics of it, I'm going to suggest that his sort of technocratic, internationalist approach is not winning over anyone. The so-called Blue Labour approach, I think, is dead in the water, really. And Blue Labour. So what I mean by that is it's so strong on defence and strong on sort of social policy, but the reality is he's not winning over anyone who's likely to vote reform, and all it does is just repel Labour's base. So I think this is just another perfect example of this government seemingly sort of willingly handing power to the right-wing populists. So again, I just find it thoroughly depressing, really. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. Bye.